Hi, this is Ash from Wingtips and welcome to this new video. This is a review of the AK Durable Supply Co. Tracer V3 wingfoil setup. I had the Tracer V3 for only a few days, but in total managed to clock around 16 hours on the foil in varying conditions. I also want to point out that I only had the 1030 sized foil and haven't had any opportunity to see what the other foils in the Tracer range are like. So this review can only really be taken in isolation as a review of the 1030 foil in that range. It would have been nice to look at other sizes in the range and see if they are comparable and have the same performance characteristics as the 1030, but unfortunately that wasn't available to me, and so we can just look at the 1030 in this review. So without further ado, let's get into looking at the construction of the AK Tracer 1030. The front wing is made up of the wing, which is also formed into the first part of the fuselage, much like an F1 wing or a Duotone front wing. So you have this lovely full carbon formed connection between your front foil and the fuselage, which makes it very hydrodynamic. And then the tail part of the fuselage plugs into that with two 6mm screws. The fuselage itself on the front wing has the mast plug into it, and it is a really tight, close connection. There's no movement in it whatsoever. Really well done, really solid and well executed. And you can see here that the intersection between the front wing and into that fuselage is really clean and is not going to induce any extra drag whatsoever. For the tail bolts on with two 6mm screws and has an innovation built into it in that you can just slide the tail forwards and backwards on those screws, and that will adjust the angle of the tail. So rather than using shims, you can just slide the tail forwards and backwards on those slots and adjust your tail angle. The foil itself is a gull wing, as you can see here, and the mast is a hollow mast. Although it is a high modulus mast, it is hollow, so it's not as stiff as a solid mast, but nevertheless it's still quite stiff. I didn't notice any movement in the wing from the mast. However, this is one of the smaller wings in the range, so it would be interesting to see whether you would feel that on one of the larger wings in the Tracer range. And for those who are interested in the statistics, it's a 1030 cm² wing with an aspect ratio of 8.2 and a wingspan of 914mm. The chord is 149mm and the chord thickness 15.5mm. The last thing I want to point out with regard to construction is that the tail is this blue colour, and that's because it's not made of carbon, it's G10. So that gives you a cheaper construction method, not quite as durable as carbon, but it does mean that if you want to buy extra tail wings, they will be cheaper because they are G10 rather than full carbon fibre. Before we get into my own thoughts and feelings on the Tracer, I thought it'd be a good idea to go to the AK website and have a look at the 3 Hydrofoil series that they have and just see what they say they're supposed to be used for. So the first of those is the Trek Hydrofoil series, and that is described as low aspect ratio for ease of use, perfect for entry-level foiling and progression, smooth lift and stability at speed. Now to me that sounds exactly like a beginner hydrofoil, so this is where they're directing their customers who are just getting into hydrofoiling, and the wings that are available in that series would seem to reflect that. They have a 1000, a 1300, a 1600 and a 2000, so there's a really big wing in there for people who are just learning and starting out on their foiling journey. The second series they have is the Plasma Hydrofoil series, and that is described as high aspect hydrofoil for pump, glide and higher speed, arc down stabilizer for efficiency and pivoting turns, modular aluminium rear fuselage. Now this to me sounds like it's something for downwinding, and they certainly mention chasing fast ocean swells or pumping with infinite glide, so this does definitely sound like downwinder territory and the wings are a 1600 and a 2050, so those are pretty large. And then lastly we have the Tracer Hydrofoil series, which is medium aspect ratio for ease of use and manoeuvrability, arc down stabilizer for directional stability and ease of use, versatile performance and high speed control. And it says it's for riders looking for the perfect balance between performance, ease of use and the ultimate manoeuvrability. So this to me sounds like it's kind of aiming in that intermediate ground, not particularly aimed at beginners, but they mention ease of use twice, so maybe a beginner could start on this foil. But they're talking about speed and ultimate manoeuvrability, and I think we're aiming here at wave riders, wingers, and the sizes also seem to reflect a more advanced rider. There's a 650, an 800, the 1030 which I've got for review, and the largest is a 1300. So these are not particularly large wings, although they are a higher aspect ratio. Okay, so let's talk about the kind of foil characteristics that we might look for when doing a review. So the first one would be the ease of getting onto foil and how the foil gets onto foil. Is it a foil that you can kick up onto foil with very little speed and it will take that, or is it a foil that you have to speed and slowly kind of rise up onto foil? There's the roll characteristics of the foil, so how it goes from rail to rail and how loose it is on the roll. There's the pitch characteristics. Is it pitchy or does it ride very stably? And also to do with pitch characteristics is how it does a bottom turn. Is it stable through the pitch on a bottom turn? And also when you're dropping into a wave, is it a foil that you have to really step on your front foot to stop it from breaching as you go down a wave? Does it drop in really reliably and without drama and make that whole process very easy for you? And then there's the yaw characteristics. So is it a foil that's very locked on the yaw so you don't really notice that it yaws very much, or is it a foil that's quite loose on the yaw so you can actually turn it in another axis beyond roll and pitch? Then there's the overall speed of the foil, the overall glide of the foil, and then related to glide, the stall speed, so how slow can you go before the foil will drop you, and also when it does drop you, how abrupt is that drop? Is it a fairly soft drop, or is it a hard drop? Is it a surprise when it drops, or do you know it's coming? And then lastly, there's how it handles wave energy. And what I mean by that is that when you're just falling through chop or waves, how much wave energy does it pick up, and how does it pick up that energy? Does it pitch up and down as it picks up wave energy, or does it just lift you neutrally as you ride through that wave energy? And those can be characteristics that really define whether you like using a foil in choppy, messy water, or whether you don't like using a particular foil in messy and choppy water. Okay, so those are the kind of criteria I'm going to look at as I go through reviewing this foil. So let's get started with the ease of getting onto foil and how it gets onto foil. Okay, so our first category is how does the Tracer V3 get onto foil? Well, this is only a 1030 foil and it's an aspect ratio of 8, and it's not a foil that particularly appreciates being kicked up onto foil when you aren't travelling fast enough for it to foil. It will basically smack back down again when you try to do that. So it's definitely a foil that you need to speed onto foil and hold down with front foot pressure until it starts to rise on its own, and then you can let it naturally start to rise up and lift you onto the foil. If you aren't going fast enough and you try and kick it up, then it will just smack down again. It's not the most violent smackdown, it's relatively controllable. You can ride through it if you try to do that, but it's definitely much easier just to speed this onto foil with your pump technique and not try and kick it up onto foil. In terms of how easily it starts to rise or how fast you need to be going for it to start to rise, it's actually very good. I thought it was really very good for a 1000 centimeter foil. It came up really quite nicely when I expected it to. It wasn't like I felt like I needed to be going at light speed before it started to lift. It was really a fairly predictable and not overly fast speed that you needed to be going for it to start to lift and to really get going and accelerate onto foil. In terms of its roll characteristics, I felt that it was very eager to roll. It was quite loose on its roll axis. It wasn't a stiff foil by any means at all. It was really very happy to roll from rail to rail, and it was very controllable in that roll from rail to rail. So it wasn't like it felt so loose that you were uncomfortable. It was just loose enough that it was fun and playful, and gave you a certain level of confidence that it had got you. You were okay, and you could roll it from wingtip to wingtip, and it wasn't going to throw you off. It was going to take it, and it wasn't going to do anything unpredictable or weird whilst you were doing that. Now I'm going to cover yaw stability next before I come on to pitch, because pitch is a little bit more complicated. But in terms of yaw stability, it's also reasonably loose on yaw. Not really loose, but reasonably loose on yaw. And this is where it makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable in recommending this foil to a complete beginner, because as a beginner it's bad enough trying to control just the roll and pitch axis of a foil, but if you introduce some looseness on the yaw axis as well, then that can really cause some problems. It's another axis to control that a beginner can really do without. So for that reason, I feel this foil is really more aimed towards intermediate riders who can appreciate that yaw axis looseness. And I wouldn't say it was really loose, it was a little bit loose. Certainly looser than I would normally feel on something like a Axis Spitfire foil or an Axis HPS. It's a little bit looser in the yaw than those types of foils, and it meant that if you were doing something like a 360 and you needed to twist the foil through the last part of the 360 to get round, then you could do that, and it was very willing to do that, and it wouldn't try and just stick to its arc and force you to foil on the roll axis all the way through the 360. You could actually twist it out of the last part relatively easily. So I'm for an intermediate rider, you can appreciate that. For a beginner, it's something you don't really want. Now on the pitch axis, this probably has a lot to do with the tail, because the tail was a 200 centimeter squared tail, which is quite a large tail, certainly larger than I would normally ride. And for that reason, I felt like the foil was really quite pitch stable, and it was very, very predictable on the pitch axis. I suspect that maybe with a smaller tail, you would certainly get a bit more pitch response, and probably a little bit more responsiveness to the pumping of the foil, because although the foil did pump really nicely when you tried to do that on a wave and there was some energy to carry it off the wave, I felt like it was more difficult to pump, and that was really more to do with the larger tail than anything else. In terms of drop in onto a wave to serve some swell, and certainly on larger swells, I felt that the pitch was really very, very controllable. It wasn't one of these foils where as you dropped into a wave it would swoop and then you would have this feeling like you really needed to control the pitch or it would blow up on you. Didn't have any of those sorts of feelings at all. It was very, very predictable dropping in on a wave, very, very easy to control your speed and your angle of attack into the wave. And also when you turned in the bottom of a wave to come back up the wave face, it provided a reasonable amount of feedback. I would say something like a Spitfire 840 provides a more confident and more pressure in that bottom turn, but the Tracer was certainly very good in the bottom turn, maybe not as good as a Spitfire, but still very, very good and very easy to do the bottom turn, very responsive in the bottom turn, and in many respects makes you feel like you're a better foiler than you maybe are. It's one of those foils that you end up doing things on it that perhaps you couldn't do on other foils. It makes you a better foiler than you perhaps currently are, and lets you get away with some things that maybe you wouldn't get away with on some more technical foils. In terms of speed, I didn't feel like the Tracer was particularly a hugely fast foil. It was very average, I would say, in terms of speed. It's a relatively thick foil section on it when you look at it from the front compared to some other foils in that 1000 centimeter size, and so it wasn't, you know, mind-blowing in terms of its overall top end and speed. And also I would have to point out that we do have the 200 centimeter tail on the back as well, which is a significant amount of drag to be pulling through the water, and I suspect that that was probably more to do with the top end of the foil than the front foil itself. And I think with a smaller tail it could probably be quite a bit quicker. But I mean, it was okay. It was plenty fast enough. It was certainly fast enough to keep up with windblown swell and ride relatively large windblown swell, and I didn't feel like I had any issues keeping up with waves or staying on waves when I needed to. In terms of glide, I felt like when there was some power in a wave to push you along, it really did capitalize on the available energy and rode bigger than I would normally expect a 1000 centimeter foil to ride. In fact, I got some exceptionally long rides on the Tracer for the size of foil that it was and for the size of wave and swell that I was trying to ride. It was very, very good at extracting energy from swell, considering that it was only a 1000 centimeter foil. We do have to remember that it is an aspect ratio of 8, so it is a relatively high aspect foil compared to some other foils on the market. But I did feel like it really did manage to capitalize on the available energy in the wave and really over deliver on what you would expect from a 1000 centimeter squared foil. In terms of stall speed, again, I felt that this was actually very good and actually where I expected it to be, because one of the big problems, or one of the worst problems you can have with a foil, is when it drops you when you're not expecting it. So you think everything's fine, you're coming around a jibe and perhaps you've lost some speed and you feel like everything's great, and then all of a sudden the foil just drops you out of nowhere and you're straight in, and that's the end of that jibe. The Tracer really was very, very predictable. I always knew when I was getting to the point where it was going to stall. I could always feel when the stall was close and was coming on, and when it did stall, although it was a relatively abrupt stall because it is a reasonably high aspect foil, it wasn't as abrupt as something like a Axis Art when those stall, or an Art Pro, which has a very, very abrupt stall when those stall out. It was a relatively predictable, relatively easy to ride through stall. You could very often stay on the board if it dropped you rather than just pitching over the front. It gave you enough notice, enough time that you could adjust your weight and ride out of it dropping you when it stalled. And the last thing I want to talk about is that when you're in choppy water or very disturbed water, how does the Tracer deal with that? And again, it's a reasonably high aspect foil in comparison to other foils, other medium aspect foil. I mean, normally a medium aspect foil you might expect to be in the 6 to 7, and the Tracer is in 8. So in terms of picking up lift in choppy water and that sort of thing, it certainly does pick it up. I did feel like it was picking up the lift in the chop, and I could feel it. But the key aspect was that when it did pick up the lift, it wasn't that it would pitch the foil up. when it did that, so it wouldn't pitch me up into a breaching situation. It would just kind of give me a bump, but it would be a horizontal bump rather than a pitching up bump. So it was relatively easy to control and keep the foil in the water when you were riding through choppy or messy water. I never really felt like it was giving me control issues or making me work too hard. Initially, when it was bumping me, I was thinking, oh, I'm not sure about this, because some foils do tend to pitch up when they get bumped, and then you can have a breach, or a wingtip can come out, and all of a sudden you've lost foiling capability, or the foil is aerated and will drop you. But the tracer was not like that. It would give you a bump, but it never really poked its nose out of the water as a result of that. And also, if it did breach a wingtip, and I breached wingtips on it many times, it managed to reattach the flow of the water and ride through it more often than not without me really even noticing, or I could hear that a breach of a wingtip had occurred, but I couldn't feel it. So it was very good in terms of managing the lift and making the lift that you could feel, you know, less of a problem. It wasn't a foil that would pitch up and just breach when you hit a big piece of chop or something like that. It had a very neutral approach to riding through that kind of heavier, choppier, more disturbed type of water. And the last thing I want to talk about is pumping the foil. So on many occasions I'd be on a piece of swell that would have some carry on it, and then the swell would disappear, and I would need to be looking ahead either to get on a piece of swell that was ahead of me, or I'd be looking back to get on a piece of swell that was behind that I could pick up and then carry on riding that piece of swell. And the tracer proved to be really quite good at carrying speed and pumping onto or back to another piece of swell. Much more capable than I was expecting, actually. I didn't expect that as a 1,000 centimeter foil it would carry that well in a pump, and it did. It was really quite capable as a little pump foil on a reasonable piece of swell, and you could carry your speed forward onto the bump in front relatively easily. It was a little harder to come off the back of a piece of swell and then pump onto a piece of swell that was behind you, but certainly getting onto pieces of swell that were in front, you could pick up speed and ride up over the top and back and onto a piece of swell that was in front of you, and that was actually really quite satisfying and easy to do. And I did get some very good swell rides doing that kind of thing. I would say that it's quite different to pump than something like an Axis Spitfire. The Axis Spitfire tends to be a foil that you kind of tap and you pump it along, and the tracer was more like a foil that you have more of a roller coasty type pump to it in order to power it along. But you gave very positive feedback when you pumped it. You could feel the energy go into the foil and it rise on the mast in response to your pump. So it was quite a good tactile feedback to the pump that encouraged you to keep trying and try to power it forward some more. Okay, so let's try and map some conclusions or final thoughts out of this. I think the best measure here is whether this is a foil that I would buy or even consider swapping from my usual Axis foils onto. And the answer to this is a resounding yes. I really did enjoy riding the tracer. It was playful, fun, and really performed remarkably well at whatever I tried to do with it. My only reservation would be it's a little slower than my current setups, but I think that is mostly down to the larger 200 centimeter tail, and I normally run much smaller tails. In terms of overall capability for an intermediate rider, I thought it was a really solid performer, and there were several occasions where it made me feel like a better foiler than I actually am. Or at least it let me get away with some things I would not ordinarily manage to pull off. And when you get that happen, it really does feel good. In terms of pros, it rides really very well. It's predictable and forgiving, and it has a really wide range of performance. The front plane design, the fitting of the mast into the fuselage, and the overall fitment of the various parts is excellent, and I like the innovation for not needing shims for the tail angle adjustment. In terms of cons, the yaw is a bit loose for beginners. It's fine for intermediates, but for a beginner I feel like that would be an extra barrier to learning. I'm also not sure whether the mast will hold up in terms of stiffness for much larger foils. I wasn't able to test this as only the 1030 was available for demo, and that is a relatively small foil, so I would want to ride the AK Hollow Mast on a much bigger foil to decide whether the mast really has the stiffness to control a much larger foil. Something I didn't mention when I was looking at the overall design was that I don't particularly like the way the carbon mast is designed with regard to how the bolts fit to it. You use flat headed bolts onto a flat surface on the top of the mast, and when you tighten those down they tend to mark up the mast. I much prefer to use countersunk bolts into countersunk holes or countersunk slots, as those tend to hold up much better. Whilst I like the idea of G10 for the tail because it makes buying tails cheaper than buying a carbon tail, I did find that the G10 tail wasn't as durable as a carbon tail, and if you ride from a stony beach where it can pick up some knocks and scrapes, then there is the concern that you can put dents and dings into your tail more easily than you could with a carbon tail. Lastly, as someone who rides from a stony beach and is often repairing scrapes and scratches on my foils, and I also do repairs for other people on foils, AK have decided to paint parts of the front foil blue, and this would make it really difficult for a foil repairer to make a nice invisible repair to a foil, or to patch up a scratch or repair a ding in the foil and hide it, because you need to be able to repaint those blue parts and make it look like it was originally, and that's very difficult because they've kind of misted this blue onto the foil. It'd be much better if the foil was just straight carbon with a matte lacquer, and then if you ever need to repair your foil or repair a ding, you can do that and you can make it look like it's almost brand new. So that would be my wish list, really, would be to get rid of the blue paint on the foil. It's a small thing, but as someone who repairs foils, it's something that I just saw immediately and thought, yeah, I really wouldn't like that. If you enjoyed this video or found it useful, then please do let me know in the comments. This is the first time I've attempted a foil review, so let me know if you think I missed something or if there is something you feel I could have mentioned or talked about. Lastly, this review wouldn't have been possible without the help of the Water Sports Centre. They had the Tracer V3 for around about a week. I borrowed it several times from their demo fleet in that time in order to be able to do this review, and they were always very happy to let me do that, so many thanks to them. And if you want to show them some support, then I'll put their links in the video description.